welcome to a special episode of our Rhetoric podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca.
I'm your host, Hannah.
And I'm your host, Arden.
Today we'll be discussing how mental health and mental illnesses are misrepresented in media. We will cover the misconceptions that are depicted across various mediums such as television, film, social media, news, etc.
As a group, we feel passionate about this topic and aim to educate others on how our ideas of mental illness are skewed by the media.
I think it would be beneficial to our listeners to try and define the mental illnesses we will be discussing today. First off, we will be discussing depression, which BetterHelp defines as a constant feeling of sadness and loss of interest which stops you from doing your normal activities. Different types of depression exist, with symptoms ranging from relatively minor to severe. Generally, depression does not result from a single event, but from a mix of events and factors. I believe it is important to note that depression affects all people differently. Next up, anxiety. Google defines anxiety in 3 different ways. It is first described as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Second, it is explained to be a desire to do something, typically accompanied by unease. Lastly, it is described as a nervous disorder characterized by a state of excessive uneasiness and apprehension, typically with compulsive behavior or panic attacks. Just like depression, every person who suffers from anxiety experiences its harsh effects differently. As someone who has lived with anxiety since a young age, the ways in which I feel anxious and experience panic and OCD tendencies have greatly changed over time.
With anxiety, as explained before, OCD is often experienced with anxiety. OCD, an acronym for Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, is defined by the American Psychiatric Association as a disorder in which people have reoccurring unwanted thoughts, ideas, or sensations, or obsessions that can make them feel driven to do something repetitively. These repetitive behaviors, such as hand washing, checking on things, or cleaning, can significantly interfere with a person's daily activities and social interactions. As there are 7 different types of OCD, which are relationship intrusive thoughts, sexual intrusive thoughts, magic thinking intrusive thoughts, religious intrusive thoughts, violent intrusive thoughts, body focus obsessions. Here's a short clip from Addison, who's a 14-year-old girl living in New York City with OCD. Her story was shared on a Vice documentary and puts in perspective what it really feels like to be born with a mental illness.
You can't see OCD. So it really gets to me when people say, like, well, I don't see you anxious, I don't see you depressed, I don't see you doing things multiple times. It's not always very obvious.
It is common that people are born with these mental illnesses. However, many may experience these mind-altering illnesses due to past trauma. Merriam-Webster sums up trauma by defining it as a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stress or physical injury or an emotional upset. Many shows and movies, especially dramas or action-based films, depict characters suffering from mental illness after a very intense trauma.
Exactly. However, more often than not, the diminished mental states of these characters who experience great traumas follow many misconceptions that the media has assumed of how people with mental illnesses think and act. Social media misconceptions are a contributing factor to this as well. We all know that social media has taken our world by storm. With the amount of screen time spent on social media, it is inevitable that we as users will come across an abundance of misinformation. According to U.S. News, studies indicate that mass media is one of the public's primary sources of information about disorders such as bipolar, schizophrenia, and depression. It is important to note that information must come with interpretation. The medium that the information is shared on should be carefully considered. Can you really trust it? It is important to keep a critical eye on your sources because research also suggests most media portrayals of mental illness are stereotypical, negative, or flat out wrong, meaning many people gain an unfavorable or inaccurate view of those with psychological disorders.
It's definitely unjust how the media portrays mental illness. Oftentimes, the media seems to portray characters acting to embody a person with mental illness as an outcast.
I definitely noticed that. There's so many instances where where people with mental illness have been portrayed as dangerous or incompetent and unserving. This is just unjust, and it's been estimated that 10% of the world's population is affected, and 20% of children and adolescents suffer from some sort of mental illness. Take Bojack Horseman as an example, an animated TV show on Netflix. It portrays a person or horse that is struggling with depression. He's also a victim of substance abuse, which creates this character that he is danger to himself and the people around him. Though the TV show he's seen backstabbing, fighting, or hurting other characters, it's a recurring theme that he can never do right by anyone or anything. All attempts to better himself often end up in failure.
Definitely. It is pretty frustrating because these stereotypes have no logic behind them. People who suffer from mental illness do not embody any of these characteristics any more or less than people who do not suffer from mental illnesses do. I think this Bojack example is really valid. I have noticed the theme of almost circling the drain in the show. It could be very harmful to viewers with little knowledge of mental illnesses to watch this show. It is basically implying that the depressed are self-destructive, have addiction issues, and no matter how hard they try, they can never succeed.
Exactly, which is really frustrating to see. These characters are shown to be outsiders when in reality, over 47 million adults in America suffer from mental illness according to the Mental Health America.
With these glaringly evident statistics in mind, it's so confusing how the media continues to misconstrue the conceptions and depictions of mental illnesses. If 47 million adults suffer firsthand from mental illness, it is safe to assume that a good amount of them have contributed to this false depiction of mental illnesses in the media. Don't you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. And as you said before, Rebecca, the number of negative and false examples of mental illness greatly outweighs the accurate and realistic portrayals.
I see this pretty much everywhere in social media. In middle school, when the social media app Tumblr was really popular, I was actually very confused about mental illness. Tumblr's depiction of anorexia and depression seemed to be portrayed as a glamorous and edgy way.
Wow, I actually 100% remember this. I can actually remember seeing so many posts that showed girls that were like extremely skinny with visible bones showing that had words written across it that said, "Pretty girls don't eat."
Yes, Tumblr glorified anorexia, depression, and suicide really badly. Instagram did too. I recently read a story on BuzzFeed about how a young girl named Hannah fell as a victim to Instagram posts promoting anorexia in 2013. She explained that the posts would have thousands of comments encouraging users to stop eating. They were often under hashtags like hashtag anorexia, hashtag Anna, and hashtag thinspiration.
I remember seeing that I remember seeing that all too. It definitely altered many young kids' mental states and body image. There's even a movie called Little Miss Sunshine. That storyline is based on a young girl who becomes anorexic to lose weight after seeing a blog post that promoted anorexia. Many young adults were definitely influenced by the ideas and posts just like that girl in that film.
Anorexia in particular is romanticized in the movie For the Love of Nancy. This film is about Nancy Walsh, a young girl who recently graduated from high school and carries an enormous amount of anxiety about the future. When she goes to college, she grows increasingly withdrawn and develops anorexia nervosa.
Unfortunately, this movie did more harm than good. It romanticized anorexia and it failed to go into medical detail and kept everything light. This gives viewers a false understanding of what an eating disorder really is and how it can affect you.
Exactly. This lack of correct representation creates barriers to accessing support. It's not a stretch to say that those with eating disorders do not reach out because they feel alienated. When the media Exactly. This lack of correct representation creates barriers to accessing support. It's not a stretch to say that those with eating disorders do not reach out because they feel alienated. When the media misrepresents eating disorders, it augments their alienation.
No, I totally agree with you. I do not think it's a stretch to say that at all. It's also really important to realize these things because it can seriously affect the people who are actually struggling.
Let's talk about media present mental illness effectively, in particular, social anxiety, that is represented in The Big Bang Theory.
Rajesh Kuthapali, or Raj, from The Big Bang Theory, represents a solid case of social anxiety disorder. In earlier seasons of the show, Raj's social anxiety cripples him by rendering him speechless around women who aren't members of his family. When he's alone with his friends, he has no problem expressing himself. But when faced with the prospect of speaking with a woman he deems attractive, Raj often uses alcohol as a social lubricant.
Roughly 15 million American adults live with social anxiety disorder, according to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. And according to that statistic, over 17 million people watched The Big Bang Theory last season.
And that's great because it allows people to actually understand what social anxiety really is and see it firsthand in one of their favorite TV shows.
TV shows really need to do more when it comes to the representation of mental illnesses. Otherwise, they will continue the harsh stigma on what it means to struggle with a mental illness.
Yeah, I totally think that as well. TV shows and movies should be held accountable for their portrayal of mental health because people are very impressionable. According to a 2008 study in the Journal of Health and Communications, it was shown that the way fictional characters experience and cope with mental illness can directly affect the way real-life people understand and react to the conditions.
I think that the way that TV shows and movies portray mental health is extremely important. However, I think it's equally, if not more important, to discuss the impact of social media has in shaping our understanding of mental health.
Definitely. Most people use at least one form of social media daily, so the content they consume should be held to the same standard as TVs and movies. Social media should be a place to help break down the stigma, not continue to build it up.
Studies show that mass media is one of the public's primary source for information on issues such as depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar. This means when posting or scrolling on social media, people need to make sure they are not contributing to sharing content that oversimplifies or it could misrepresent these very serious issues.
Exactly. And viral videos and images on platforms like Instagram or Twitter or TikTok, they're contributing to the mental health issues because they're campaigning them as trendy and cute, and it's just encouraging people to believe that it isn't as serious as it really is.
It's definitely an issue I see on most social media frequently, mostly teenagers posting about their mental health issues as a glorifying way.
Yeah, me too. I've noticed this almost trend and think it's a very counterproductive way to use social media. I think there are many ways you can post about your mental health struggles online and share your story while still being helpful to others.
Yes, and there's so many ways to positively use social media. Just a few examples are sharing self-help tips, being a positive example for people, and starting constructive conversations about mental health, and being supportive without judgment.
And social media could be such a great resource. I think we should all work together to make it an inclusive place to share stories and tips to help others struggling with the same problem.
I agree. Social media, movies, and TV all can be great resources to educate ourselves on mental health when what we are shown is mental health represented correctly.
Increasing our awareness, education, and support on mental health will create a much more understanding and accepting world.
One of the most important things we can do to help break the stigma around mental health starts with individual people who want to make a change.
If you have made it this far in the podcast, we can assume you are one of these people who wants to make active change in the way the world perceives mental health.
We want to thank you guys for caring and listening on the way that mental health is perceived in media.
And thank you for listening.
Bye.